My name is Private Jonathan Hale. I was 21 years old on February 12, 1945, when the Nazis tied me to a wooden post in a freezing German prison yard and sentenced me to die. Not for escaping, not for fighting back, but for reading a Bible my mother gave me before I left Kansas. That morning, as the firing squad raised their rifles and shouted, "Aim!" I whispered what I believed would be the final prayer of my life. But then Jesus stepped in. A deafening thunder exploded from a completely clear sky. The ground shook under our feet, and chaos swept through the camp like a wave. That supernatural moment stopped the execution and gave me the chance to run toward freedom. This is the testimony of how Jesus Christ reached into a Nazi prison yard on a winter morning in 1945 and saved an American soldier from death. I was born in Dodge City, Kansas, a quiet place of long wheat fields, dusty summer winds, and church bells that rang every Sunday morning. My father worked as a railroad mechanic, and my mother was a school teacher who believed every child should know at least one Bible verse by heart before they finished first grade. I grew up in a home where faith was not a performance, but a way of breathing. We prayed before meals, we sang hymns on the porch after supper, and every night my mother would place her hand on my head and say, "Jesus will guide you if you listen." I never knew how much those words would matter until the war came knocking on my door. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, I was only 17, just finishing high school. I watched the newsreels in town with my friends and felt a fire burn inside me, a mixture of fear, duty, and the belief that freedom was worth protecting. By the time I turned 18, I made up my mind I would enlist in the United States Army. My mother cried quietly when I told her, but she didn't try to stop me. Instead, she placed a small New Testament in my hand, the same one her father had carried in World War I. "Jonathan," she said softly, "keep this close. When you cannot hear my voice, let this remind you that God is still near." I tucked that Bible into the breast pocket of my uniform and promised her I would keep it safe. Training at Fort Riley, Kansas was the first time I had ever been away from home. The days were long, the nights were cold, and the drills were harder than anything I had ever done. But I felt myself changing. I learned to march, shoot, dig trenches, and follow orders without question. I also learned the weight of silence when letters from home came slower than expected. After months of training, I was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, a unit known for its toughness and fighting spirit. We boarded a troop ship headed for North Africa and later moved into Italy as the front pushed north. I carried my mother's Bible with me through every battlefield, every muddy trench, and every sleepless night. Even when I didn't understand what God was doing, holding that Bible made me feel like I wasn't alone. Life in Italy was difficult in ways no one could truly prepare for. The mountains were steep, the winter rain felt like needles, and enemy fire echoed across the valleys without warning. I saw my first real battle near Anzio, where the ground shook from artillery and the sky turned red from explosions. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't fearless. My hands shook so badly during one firefight that my rifle slipped. But every time I felt fear tightening around my chest, I touched that little Bible in my pocket. Sometimes I whispered verses I remembered from childhood, especially Psalm 23. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Those words kept me steady when everything else felt like it was falling apart. War aged all of us quickly, but faith kept me from collapsing under the weight of it. In the summer of 1944, our unit pushed north toward France, moving with the Allied advance. We traveled by truck, foot, and sometimes by sheer desperation. Near the border of Germany, our luck ran out. During a night march through the woods near Sarrebourg, we were ambushed by a group of well-prepared German soldiers. Machine gun fire erupted from the trees, and chaos swallowed us instantly. I dropped behind a fallen log and tried to return fire, but visibility was terrible. In the confusion, a grenade exploded nearby, throwing me back and knocking the breath from my lungs. When I came to, German troops were everywhere, shouting orders and rounding up survivors. I reached for my rifle, but a soldier kicked it away and forced my hands behind my head. That was the moment I realized the war had taken a new turn for me. I was now a prisoner. They marched us for hours, through forests and muddy roads, until my legs felt like they would give out. Every time someone stumbled, the guards yelled and pointed their rifles, reminding us that mercy was not a luxury we should expect. By the next day, we arrived at a train station where dozens of other captured soldiers were already waiting. They packed us into a cattle car, tight, suffocating, and dark, and the train jerked forward toward Germany. We didn't know where we were being taken. Some whispered that it might be a labor camp. Others feared it was somewhere far worse. I held my boot tightly against my chest because inside it, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was my Bible. I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. If I lost everything else, I needed that one thing to stay alive inside. After 2 miserable days, the train finally stopped, and the doors slid open to reveal a sprawling barbed wire compound. A guard announced the name, Stalag VII-A, located near Moosburg, Bavaria. It was one of the largest German POW camps of the entire war. The moment we stepped out, the smell of smoke and sweat filled the air. Prisoners from different nations, Americans, British, French, Polish, walked around with hollow eyes. Some looked years older than they truly were. We were processed, searched, and assigned to barracks that offered little protection from the cold. The camp was overcrowded, and the rations were barely enough to sustain us. I tried to stay hopeful, reminding myself that others had survived worse, but deep inside, I felt the weight of uncertainty. I didn't know how long I would be here, or if I would leave alive. Inside the barracks, I slept on the second level of a wooden bunk bed that creaked with every movement. Rats scurried in the dark corners, and the sound of distant coughing filled the night. The guards were strict, and they made it clear from the beginning that any form of resistance or anything they considered enemy ideology would be punished. Some prisoners held onto small tokens of home, photos, rings, torn letters. I held on to my New Testament. To keep it safe, I wrapped it in cloth and tucked it inside my boot every morning. During evening roll call, I never let it leave my side. I knew that if the guards ever found it, I would be in serious trouble, but I also knew that losing it would break something inside me that the war hadn't touched. It was my last connection to who I used to be. As days turned into weeks, I began to understand the rhythm of life inside Stalag VII-A. Prisoners woke early, stood in freezing temperatures for roll call, and then scattered to perform whatever labor tasks the guards assigned. Some worked in nearby farms, others in workshops or storage areas. I was placed in a group responsible for clearing snow from paths and carrying supplies. The work was tiring, but I learned that keeping busy protected the mind from despair. At night, prisoners shared stories, hopes, and sometimes tears. Hunger was constant, cold was constant, but the hardest part was not knowing when the war would end or what would happen to us. It felt like time inside the camp moved differently, slow, heavy, and uncertain. Yet through everything, I repeated one prayer over and over: God, stay with me. Even in the darkness of the camp, there were moments of quiet faith. A small group of prisoners met in secret, whispering prayers and sharing memories of church back home. I joined them whenever the guards weren't watching. We didn't have a chaplain, a cross, or a hymn book, but we had each other. One night, I carefully removed my Bible from my boot and read a few verses from the Gospel of John. The men listened with eyes closed, some silently crying. Those moments gave us strength the camp could never steal, but they also brought risk. We knew the guards considered any religious activity suspicious, especially if it involved Americans. So we met quietly, like men holding on to the last small flame in a world full of shadows. I knew that sooner or later someone would notice, but I hoped that day would never come. My faith and my Bible kept me going, but they also put a target on my back. One guard in particular, Sergeant Matthias Vogel, watched me closely. He was sharp-eyed, stern, and rarely smiled. He seemed to sense when something was hidden, as if he could smell secrets. Every time he passed by our barracks, he paused longer near my bunk, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. I prayed he would never discover the New Testament in my boot, because I knew what it would mean. But despite the fear, despite the risk, I couldn't let it go. God had carried me through every battle, every cold night, and every moment of terror. I held on to that Bible not as a book, but as a lifeline. I didn't know it then, but the very faith that kept me alive would soon bring me face to face with death. Life inside Stalag VII-A became a slow battle between fear and faith. After several weeks in the camp, I learned how to move quietly, speak softly, and hide anything that mattered. The Germans controlled every part of our bodies, but they didn't know how much strength a man could draw from his soul. Every night, after our labor duties and the freezing roll call, a few prisoners gathered around my bunk. We waited until the lights dimmed and the guards grew tired of patrolling. Then, when the barracks settled into silence, I would reach into my boot and carefully unwrap the Bible hidden inside. The moment I opened it, the men leaned closer, hungry for hope. It was the only warmth we had in that bitter place, and we treated each word like it was gold. I didn't plan to become the one who read scripture in the camp. It happened slowly, almost naturally. One evening, a British soldier named Thomas noticed me holding something under my blanket. When he asked what it was, I hesitated, fearing the consequences, but something inside me pushed me to trust him. I showed him the small New Testament, its pages worn from years of being handled. His eyes widened, not in judgment, but in longing. "Can you read something aloud?" he whispered. The request felt dangerous, but also necessary. I nodded, and that night I read the first few verses of John. When I looked up, I saw tears on his cheeks. That moment changed everything. Word spread quietly among the prisoners. I never announced anything, but one by one they came. Americans, British, even a few French soldiers. They didn't come for entertainment. They came because despair hung over the camp like smoke, and they needed something stronger than rations or blankets. Reading the Bible to them wasn't about preaching, it was about surviving. The guards never imagined soldiers would risk punishment for a handful of whispered verses, but they didn't understand what it meant to be broken far from home. They didn't understand how powerful hope could be when everything else was lost. Even men who claimed they had no faith listened with stillness. For a few minutes each night, the war vanished, and the room felt like a small corner of heaven. But the more we gathered, the more I sensed danger growing around us. Stalag VII-A was not a place where secrets stayed hidden forever. Prisoners talked, guards watched, and suspicion spread quickly. Some POWs warned me that if the Germans caught me with a Bible, the punishment would be severe. They called it enemy propaganda, and the rules against religious materials were strict, especially in camps holding American soldiers. I tried to be careful, reading only when we were certain no guards were nearby. But danger in the camp didn't come loudly. It moved in shadows. And one shadow belonged to Sergeant Matthias Vogel, the guard who had been watching me more than the others. His silence worried me more than his authority. Vogel was a tall man with a sharp jaw and eyes that missed nothing. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice carried a cold certainty that made men straighten up instantly. For reasons I didn't understand, he seemed to pay special attention to me. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Perhaps he was assigned to our barracks more often. But soon I noticed patterns, how he paused near my bunk during inspections, how his gaze lingered when I returned from labor, how he sometimes entered the room unexpectedly just to scan the men. Each time I felt my heart race, praying he wouldn't discover the New Testament hidden in my boot. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but deep inside I feared that my time was running out. One evening, after returning from clearing snow around the officers' quarters, I sensed something was wrong. As soon as I stepped into the barracks, several prisoners glanced at me with expressions that mixed warning and helplessness. Before I could ask what had happened, the door swung open, and Sergeant Vogel walked in with 2 other guards. He ordered everyone to stand at attention, his boots clicking sharply on the wooden floor. My stomach tightened. The guards began searching bunks, blankets, crates, and even the cracks in the walls. It was a full inspection, thorough, aggressive, deliberate. I knew immediately that someone had said something, or Vogel had grown suspicious enough to act without proof. Either way, I realized the hour I had feared was finally here. When Vogel reached my bunk, he didn't search blindly. He stared at me first, long enough to make my hands tremble. Then he ordered me to remove my boot. For a moment, my mind froze. I wanted to lie, to pretend I didn't understand, but I knew it wouldn't help. Slowly, I untied my boot, feeling every eye in the room fixed on me. When I pulled it off, Vogel snatched it from my hands and shook it hard. The small wrapped bundle fell onto the floor. Time seemed to stop. No one spoke. No one breathed. The guard beside him picked up the bundle, ripped the cloth open, and held up the New Testament for everyone to see. Vogel's lips tightened, and his voice came out sharp and controlled. "Whose book is this?" My first instinct was to deny it. Fear rose inside me like a wave, reminding me that claiming the Bible could lead to punishment far worse than solitary confinement. But lying didn't feel right. My mother's voice echoed in my memory. "Jonathan, your faith is who you are." I lifted my chin and said the words that sealed my fate. "It's mine." A heavy silence fell over the barracks. The guards exchanged glances, and Vogel stared at me like he had been waiting for this answer. "You admit it?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I admit it." He stepped back, motioned to the other guards, and gave a simple order that chilled every man in the room. "Take him." They marched me out of the barracks into the freezing night. The camp looked different when you were the prisoner under special guard. Barricades felt taller, lights felt harsher, and every sound seemed magnified. The guards pushed me toward the commandant's office near the center of the camp. I knew enough about German military rules to understand the seriousness of the situation. Possessing unauthorized religious materials was considered defiance, especially when the material came from an enemy nation. They saw the Bible not as a harmless book, but as a symbol of resistance, an unapproved source of strength. When the guards shoved me into the office, the camp commandant looked up from his desk with a stern expression that held no trace of mercy. He asked me to explain why I had the Bible. My answer was simple. It belonged to my mother. I read it to keep hope alive. I didn't mention the nightly gatherings. I didn't mention the other prisoners. If I was going to suffer, I didn't want anyone else suffering with me. The commandant's face hardened. He called the Bible propaganda, accusing me of trying to influence prisoners against the Reich. I tried to protest, but he slammed his fist on the table and shouted that my words were meaningless. He then delivered my punishment in a cold, emotionless voice. "You will be placed in solitary confinement. Your final judgment will be delivered in the morning." The guards dragged me away before I could say another word. Solitary confinement in Stalag VII-A wasn't just a punishment. It was a slow assault on the mind. They threw me into a small concrete cell beneath the administrative building. There were no windows, only a slit near the ceiling that let in a faint draft of winter air. The floor was damp, and the darkness swallowed everything. When the guards locked the door, the echo of the latch felt like a hammer falling. I sat in the corner, shaking from cold and shock. Losing the Bible tore something inside me, but the heavier pain came from uncertainty. I had no idea what the final judgment would be, but I sensed it would not be mild. The silence of the cell pressed against my ears, and I felt fear crawling into my heart like a shadow. Hours passed, maybe more, maybe less. Time disappeared in that place. Suddenly, footsteps approached outside my door. Keys rattled. The metal door opened, and two guards stepped inside. One of them carried a piece of paper with an official stamp. He read it aloud without emotion. "Private Jonathan Hale, you have been sentenced for possession of unauthorized enemy literature and for spiritual defiance of camp authority. Execution is scheduled at dawn." The words echoed inside my chest like thunder. They didn't shout. They didn't glare. They simply spoke the sentence and left. When the door closed again, I felt the full weight of it. I was going to die because I read the Bible. The reality hit me like a blow. Dawn was only hours away, but even in that darkness, even with death approaching, something inside me refused to break. I pressed my hand against the cold floor, closed my eyes, and whispered the only prayer I could form. "God, stay close." I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I would ever see home again. But I knew one thing with complete certainty. If this was where my journey ended, then I would meet it the same way I had lived each day since the war began, with faith, even in fear. What I didn't know was that the night ahead would change everything. And the dawn I feared would become the moment heaven stepped into the yard of Stalag VII-A. When the guards left and the heavy silence returned, I leaned my head against the cold wall and tried to steady my breathing. The cell felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer after I heard the word execution. It is strange how quickly life can shrink when death steps into the room. Every sound outside, the distant barking of a dog, the faint clanking of a metal gate, felt amplified, reminding me that the world kept moving while mine was slowly closing in. I tried to pray, but the words tangled with fear. My mind repeated the same awful thought. Dawn is coming. I pressed my palms together and whispered, "Lord, stay with me," because I didn't know what else to say. The cold air wrapped around me like a shroud, and I felt my heart pounding hard enough to shake my whole body. I sat on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest, trying to stop the shivering that came from something deeper than cold. For the first time since I was captured, I wished I could hear my mother's voice. I wished I could feel her hand on my shoulder the way she used to when thunderstorms rolled across Kansas. She always said, "God never leaves his own, even when the night is long." I repeated those words quietly, trying to believe them. Memories drifted to me, warm evenings on the porch, the smell of freshly baked bread, my father laughing softly as he carved wood in the barn. Those images felt like pieces of a life that belonged to someone else, someone safe. War had changed me, but this moment waiting to die, forced me to confront every fear I had pushed aside. Time inside that cell stretched and twisted. I didn't know whether minutes or hours had passed. The darkness made it impossible to tell. I traced my finger along the concrete floor, grounding myself in something real, because everything inside my chest felt unreal. I imagined the sun rising over Kansas fields, golden light spreading across the land, and for a moment I wished I could see one more sunrise like that. But the dawn waiting for me here would bring rifles, commands, and the end of everything I knew. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to cry. Tears felt too human for that place, too soft for what lay ahead. Still, a part of me longed for the freedom to break down, to release the fear building up inside me. As the stillness grew heavier, I remembered the men who had listened to me read the Bible in the barracks. Their faces returned to me, tired, wounded, lonely, but filled with hope when Scripture touched them. I wondered if they knew what had happened, if they were lying awake in their bunks worrying about me. I hoped none of them would feel guilty. It wasn't their fault. I chose to read. I chose to keep the Bible hidden. If this was the cost of holding on to my faith, then I had to face it with courage. I drew a slow breath and placed my hand over my heart, imagining that little New Testament resting there like it had for months. It was gone now, taken by Vogel, but the words inside it were still alive in my memory. I closed my eyes and began to recite verses silently, letting them fill the silence inside me. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? I breathed those words in and out like they were oxygen. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The cell didn't warm, the walls didn't widen, but something inside me steadied. I didn't feel brave, not in the way soldiers in stories do, but I felt anchored. Fear still moved through me like a living thing, but faith pushed back against it, reminding me that death was not the end, that God saw me even here. I whispered, "If this is my time, give me strength to face it." Saying it aloud settled something deep in my soul. A few hours later, though I couldn't tell how many, footsteps approached the cell. My body tensed, expecting the guards to take me early, but instead the door opened and a guard I'd never seen before stepped inside. He wasn't stern or hostile like the others. He carried a metal cup of water and set it beside me without speaking. His eyes flicked toward the corridor to make sure no one was watching. Then he crouched slightly and whispered, "Pray for me." The words hit me harder than any blow. I stared at him, stunned. He didn't wait for a response. He simply stood, nodded once, and left. The door closed softly behind him. My hands shook, not from fear this time, but from the realization that God was reaching into this place in ways I couldn't understand. I whispered, "I will," and felt a strange warmth rise in my chest. The guard's unexpected kindness lingered in my mind long after he disappeared. I replayed his words over and over, wondering what burdens he carried, what guilt or fear weighed on him. Maybe he too was trapped by war in ways no uniform could hide. His plea didn't erase my terror, but it reminded me that even in a place built for suffering, compassion could still appear like a small flame in the darkness. I held on to that thought like a lifeline. If God could touch the heart of a German guard in a Nazi camp, then maybe he hadn't abandoned me after all. I leaned back against the wall and whispered prayers for the guard, for the prisoners I had read to, and even for Vogel, though it was difficult. Prayer was all I had left, but it was also the one thing no one could take from me. The silence grew deeper, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I felt exhaustion settling into my bones, but sleep would not come. Instead, I thought about the journey that had led me here. My mother giving me the New Testament, the battles we fought, the nights we spent shivering in the barracks, the faces of men who found hope in whispered scripture. None of that felt wasted. I had seen darkness, but I had also seen glimpses of light. And now, on the edge of death, I realized that faith wasn't proven in safety. It was proven in fire. I whispered, "Lord, I trust you," letting the words sink into me slowly. My breath steadied and my heartbeat slowed. Even though fear still pressed against me, something deeper, something steady and quiet began to rise within. A little later, something happened that I cannot explain in any earthly way. The cell was freezing, my breath visible in the air, yet suddenly I felt a warm breeze sweep across my face. It wasn't strong, just gentle enough to notice, but impossible in that underground room. The air shifted, carrying a sense of peace that made my eyes sting with emotion. I straightened slowly, feeling the warmth settle over my shoulders like an invisible blanket. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't hope, it was presence. I felt it so clearly that my hands trembled. A quiet whisper, not from outside, but within the deepest part of me, said, "You are not alone." I exhaled shakily, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. In that moment, I believed with all my heart that Jesus was with me. The warmth didn't stay long, but it left something behind, a calmness that wrapped around my fear and softened it. My breathing became slow and steady, and even the shadows in the corners of the cell didn't seem as threatening. I sat there for a long time, letting the peace settle into my spirit. For the first time since hearing my sentence, I felt ready, not to die, but to face whatever awaited me at dawn with dignity and faith. If God had come into that cold cell to comfort me, then the morning didn't belong to the guards or the commandant or even death. It belonged to Him. I pressed my hand over my heart and whispered, "Thank you," because no other words could express the gratitude filling me. After that strange, holy moment passed, exhaustion finally pulled at me. I didn't sleep fully, but I drifted in and out of a heavy, dreamless rest. I woke to the faint sound of boots walking in the corridor, the rhythm slow and deliberate. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew dawn must be near. The cell remained dark, but a faint glow entered through the narrow gap near the ceiling, morning light. I sat upright, gripping my knees, breathing slowly to control the shaking in my hands. The boots stopped right outside my cell. Keys rattled. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. But even in terror, that quiet inner peace held me steady, reminding me of the warmth I had felt just hours earlier. The door opened, and 2 guards stepped inside, their faces unreadable. One of them gave a short command that needed no explanation. "Stand." My legs trembled as I pushed myself to my feet. I expected to collapse under the weight of fear, but I didn't. Somehow, I stood tall, even as my pulse hammered in my ears. The guards moved behind me, gripping my arms. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around my wrists. Every sound echoed, the clink of the chains, the footsteps, the creaking door. The guards led me out of the cell and into the corridor where I had walked earlier. Only this time, each step brought me closer to the yard where my life was supposed to end. I whispered one final prayer beneath my breath. "Lord, walk with me into the light." As they marched me toward the exit, the air grew colder, sharper, and the faint glow outside grew brighter with each passing moment. The guards said nothing. I said nothing, but inside my heart, something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled me. The peace that had wrapped around me in the night became a shield stronger than anything I could explain. When we reached the final door leading to the open yard, I inhaled deeply, knowing that whatever awaited me beyond it would change everything. The guard pushed the door open, and the first breath of dawn touched my face. That was the moment everything began. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap the moment the guards pushed me through the door. Dawn had only just begun, painting the sky with a pale gray light. The camp was unusually still, as if the entire place held its breath. Frost covered the ground in thin, shimmering layers, crunching softly under the boots of the guards marching beside me. My hands were cuffed behind my back, and each step made the metal bite into my skin, but I kept my eyes forward. My heart pounded, not wildly like before, but with a steady, heavy rhythm. The peace I felt in the cell lingered inside me, even as my breath fogged the cold air and the execution yard came into view through the thin morning mist. The yard looked larger than I remembered. I had seen it only once before from a distance, but now, walking into it with chains around my wrists, everything appeared sharper and more threatening. The wooden post stood near the far wall, marked with deep scratches from past bullets. The ground was uneven, frozen in hard ridges. A small squad of German soldiers waited near the post, their rifles resting against their shoulders. Some looked bored, others tense, but none looked away when I approached. I felt their eyes on me like cold hands pressing against my skin. To the right, a few prisoners stood near the barracks fence, watching silently. Their faces were pale, their hands gripping the wire as if holding themselves together. Seeing them made my throat tighten, but I lowered my gaze and kept walking. The guards stopped me in the center of the yard and forced me to face the wooden post. The morning air smelled of damp earth and old smoke. A thin wind pushed across the yard. Lifting a few strands of my hair, I tried to steady my breathing. My legs trembled, but I refused to fall. The officer in charge walked toward me, his long coat swaying with each step. He carried a small clipboard and glanced at me without emotion. "Private Jonathan Hale," he said, his voice cutting through the cold. "By order of the camp command, you are to be executed for possession of forbidden enemy material and for defiance against camp authority." The words floated around me, strangely distant, as if spoken through water. I nodded slightly, not trusting my voice to hold steady. Another guard stepped behind me and unlocked the cuffs only long enough to pull my arms forward and bind my wrists to the wooden post. The ropes were rough against my skin, tightening until my hands went numb. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to block the world out, but to gather the strength I needed to face what was coming. My breath shook as I exhaled. I whispered inside my mind, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." That simple prayer steadied me more than anything else could. When I opened my eyes again, the firing squad had taken their positions, forming a straight line several meters away. Their rifles pointed downward for the moment, but their posture told me they were ready. A sudden memory of Kansas came to me, standing in an open field as a boy, watching the sunrise glow on the golden wheat. It had felt peaceful, endless, full of possibility. But here, surrounded by barbed wire and rifles, the dawn carried a different meaning. This one marked the end of my life. Yet somehow, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet ache for home and the people I loved. The officer raised his hand to signal the squad to prepare. I watched as the soldiers lifted their rifles, the sound of shifting metal echoing lightly through the yard. My breathing slowed as I braced myself for the moment the barrels would aim at my chest. The officer's voice cut the silence. "Ready!" The soldiers lifted their rifles to firing position. The cold morning air filled with tension so thick it felt like a weight pressing against my skin. I lowered my gaze to the frozen ground, tracing the cracks in the earth with my eyes to keep from staring at the rifles. The officer continued, "Aim!" The rifles rose in unison, their barrels glinting in the thin sunlight. I closed my eyes gently, not out of fear, but out of surrender. It wasn't death I was surrendering to, but God. I breathed in deeply, letting the cold fill my lungs. I whispered silently, "Lord Jesus, if this is my last breath on earth, take me into your arms." For a brief moment, everything felt still, like time itself had paused to watch the scene unfold. But before the officer could shout the final command, something happened that none of us could have expected. A deafening crack tore through the sky, louder than any explosion I had heard in battle. My eyes snapped open in shock. The sound wasn't the sharp report of a rifle. It was thunder, deep, violent, rolling across the camp with the force of a storm. Yet when I looked up, the sky above us was perfectly clear, not a cloud in sight. The soldiers flinched, their rifles jerking off target. Some stumbled backward, others shouted in confusion. The officer turned sharply, looking around as if expecting a shell to fall nearby. But nothing moved except the air itself, which pulsed with a sudden burst of wind. The ground beneath my feet trembled lightly at first, then stronger, shaking the frozen earth enough to send ripples of dust into the air. The guards exchanged frantic glances. One soldier dropped his rifle, his hands shaking. Another took a step back, whispering something I couldn't hear. The officer yelled at them to hold their positions, but even he couldn't hide the fear that had flashed across his face. The trembling intensified for a moment, as if the earth itself had spoken. Then, with a sharp crack, a bolt of white light descended near the guard tower, bright enough to make me flinch even with the sun rising. The tower shook violently. A chunk of wood splintered off and fell to the ground below. The siren mounted on the tower flickered and died, leaving the yard in shocked silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The firing squad stood frozen, staring at the sky. The officer lowered his hand, uncertain of what to do. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not from fear now, but from awe. I didn't understand what was happening, but something inside me whispered that this was no ordinary moment. The air around us carried a strange pressure, a sense of power that didn't belong to the camp or the soldiers. A gust of wind swept across the yard, lifting dust into small spirals. The soldiers blinked against it, confused and disoriented. The ropes around my wrists pressed into my skin as my arms shifted slightly in the wind, but I barely felt the cold anymore. I felt something else, something warm, familiar, and overwhelming. Chaos erupted suddenly. One guard shouted to another. The officer barked new orders, trying to regain control, but the men weren't listening. Several soldiers backed away from the firing line, fear written plainly on their faces. One man crossed himself quickly. Others whispered to each other, glancing at the sky as if expecting another burst of thunder. The officer's voice cracked as he yelled for them to get back into formation, but no one obeyed him. Then, as if joining the confusion, the camp alarm began to ring faintly, struggling to function after the surge that had hit the tower. The metallic whine echoed unevenly through the grounds. Guards began running across the yard in different directions, unsure what emergency they were responding to. I stood there, bound to the post, watching everything unfold as if witnessing someone else's dream. The execution was ruined. The command shattered, the soldiers scattered, and in the middle of the chaos, a figure approached me from the side, A guard I recognized, but had never expected to see there. It was the same man who had brought me water in the cell and whispered, "Pray for me." His steps were quick but careful, moving between the panicked soldiers as if he didn't want to draw attention. When he reached me, he didn't speak at first. He pulled a small knife from his belt and began cutting the ropes around my wrists with urgent, precise motions. My heart raced faster, not from fear, but from disbelief. He leaned close, his voice a low whisper, barely audible beneath the noise around us. "Run," he said. "God has given you a second chance." The final rope snapped, and my arms fell free, numb from being bound. I stared at him, unsure whether to speak. But he shook his head firmly. "Go. Now." He stepped back, keeping his body angled to block the view of nearby guards. My legs trembled as I pushed away from the post. I couldn't feel my hands yet, but I forced them to move. I turned toward the edge of the yard where the fence met the tree line beyond the camp. The guard gave me one last nod, one filled with urgency and something like compassion. Before doubt could take hold, I ran. My steps were unsteady at first, but the cold air filled my lungs and drove me forward. Behind me, shouts erupted as guards noticed movement, but the chaos from the strange thunder and trembling kept their attention divided. I sprinted across the yard, weaving between shadows and equipment. Each breath felt like a flame in my chest, but I didn't slow. When I reached a corner of the fence, the Christian guard was already there, holding the wire open just enough for me to slip through. I ducked under it, tearing my sleeve on the metal, but I didn't stop. The moment my feet hit the open ground outside the camp, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: freedom. I ran toward the forest beyond the prison fence, every muscle burning, every breath sharp. Shouts rose behind me, but the distance grew quickly as branches whipped against my arms and snow crunched beneath my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The trees swallowed me like a dark, living shield, and the sounds of the camp faded behind me. I stumbled deeper into the forest, my heart pounding with fear and gratitude. I whispered breathlessly, "Thank you, God," over and over again. I knew the danger wasn't over. I knew the next hours would decide whether I lived or died. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had just witnessed a miracle. The forest swallowed me the moment I crossed beneath the first line of trees, and for a brief second, the darkness felt like safety. The air was colder here, sharper, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. My legs burned as I pushed deeper into the woods, branches scratching my face and clothes. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. My breath came in fast, desperate bursts, each exhale forming a cloud that vanished behind me. I knew the guards would recover from the chaos any minute, and once they did, they would search every inch of the surrounding area. The snow beneath my boots made it hard to move quietly, but I forced myself to keep going, weaving through the trees until the sounds from the camp faded into nothing but memory. After several minutes, my legs gave out, and I collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air. The cold seeped into my bones, making my hands tremble uncontrollably. I pressed my forehead against the rough bark and tried to slow my breathing. The escape had happened so fast that my mind struggled to catch up. One moment I was facing execution. The next I was free, running for my life through a German forest. I looked back through the trees and saw nothing but shadows. No guards yet, no dogs. But I knew that wouldn't last. I forced myself to stand again, using the log for support. Fear pushed me forward. Hope pulled me forward. And deep inside, the memory of the miracle I had just witnessed gave me strength I didn't think I had left. The forest around me stretched endlessly, with tall pine trees forming thick walls on every side. Their branches blocked the early morning light, leaving long streaks of darkness across the ground. I walked quickly, staying low, keeping close to the shadows. Every sound made my heart jump, a snapping twig, the distant hoot of an owl, even my own breathing. My body was weak, still recovering from days of hunger and the shock of almost dying. But something inside me refused to slow down. I knew that every minute counted. If the guards found my trail, they would set dogs on it. I tried to walk on rocks, frozen patches of ground, anything that wouldn't hold footprints, but it was impossible to avoid the snow completely. Still, I moved as carefully as I could, praying with each step. Hours seemed to pass as I continued through the woods. The sun rose higher, casting pale light through the branches. My stomach growled painfully, reminding me I hadn't eaten since the previous morning. My fingers were numb, stiff from cold and lack of blood flow. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep warm, but the thin prison clothes offered little protection against the winter chill. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where a narrow stream cut through the land. The water looked icy, but I knelt down and took a few sips anyway, letting the cold liquid soothe my dry throat. I wiped my mouth and looked around, trying to decide which direction to take. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, snow. But somewhere beyond this forest, the Allied lines were pushing deeper into Germany. If I could reach them, I would survive. I followed the stream for a while, thinking it might lead me to some sign of civilization. The ground became slippery, and I nearly fell several times, catching myself on nearby branches. As I walked, I heard a faint sound behind me. I froze instantly. Voices, German voices. My chest tightened as I crouched low behind a cluster of bushes. The voices grew clearer, mixed with the distant bark of a dog. Panic surged through me, but I kept still, barely breathing. A patrol was searching the forest, just as I feared. I lay flat on the cold ground, the snow soaking through my clothes. The sound of crunching footsteps grew louder, passing dangerously close to my hiding place. I closed my eyes, silently begging God to keep me hidden. After what felt like an eternity, the voices moved farther away, fading slowly until the forest was quiet again. When I was certain the patrol had passed, I crawled out of the bushes and continued moving, this time doubling my pace. I knew they would sweep the area systematically. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and the camp. The forest grew denser as I pressed on, the trees crowding together like silent guards. My legs ached, my feet throbbed, and every breath felt like fire in my chest. But stopping wasn't an option. By early afternoon, the sky began to darken again, clouds gathering overhead. Snowflakes drifted gently down, covering my tracks faster than before. I thanked God for that small mercy. The snow made it harder to move, but it also made it harder for the patrols to follow my prints. I kept walking until the trees began to thin, revealing small, rolling fields beyond the forest. In the distance, smoke rose from a chimney, thin, steady, a sign of human life. My heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. Approaching anyone in Germany was dangerous. I didn't know whether the people living there would help me or turn me over to the soldiers, but I also knew I wouldn't survive another night alone in the woods. I needed warmth. I needed food. I needed shelter. I adjusted my torn sleeve and began walking toward the small farmhouse, staying low and moving through the tall grass that surrounded the clearing. As I got closer, I saw that the house was old, with wooden walls darkened by weather. A dim light glowed from the window. I hesitated near the side of the barn, trying to decide what to do. Hunger gnawed at my insides, and the cold felt unbearable. Finally, I whispered a short prayer and stepped toward the back door of the house. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door opened slightly, revealing a woman with gray hair tied back in a simple knot. Her eyes widened when she saw me, a young American soldier in torn prisoner clothing shivering on her doorstep. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she stepped aside and whispered, "Come quickly." Her voice carried urgency, not fear, and I obeyed without thinking. She closed the door behind me and led me into a small kitchen warmed by a wood-burning stove. The warmth inside the house felt like stepping into another world. My frozen hands tingled painfully as the heat reached them. The woman looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Sit," she said softly. I sat at the wooden table, my eyes scanning the room nervously. A moment later, an older man entered from another doorway. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were gentle. He studied me silently before nodding once, as if confirming something. Then he said in a low voice, "You escaped the camp." I swallowed hard, unsure whether to answer. He seemed to sense my fear and added, "You don't need to explain. God brings people to our door for a reason." His words stunned me. I hadn't expected kindness, much less faith. The woman placed a bowl of warm broth in front of me. The smell alone made my eyes water. I whispered, "Thank you," and she gave a small smile. As I ate, the man sat across from me. "My name is Heinrich," he said quietly. "This is my wife, Elsa. We are Christians." His voice trembled slightly, as if the confession itself was dangerous. Elsa sat beside him and added, "We have prayed for the end of this war every day. We know what the soldiers do in the camps. We know many things God does not approve of." I listened intently, feeling warmth spread through my chest, not just from the food, but from their words. It felt unreal that in the heart of Germany, I had stumbled upon a family who shared the same faith that had nearly cost me my life. After I finished the broth, Heinrich handed me a warm blanket and motioned for me to follow him into a small bedroom at the back of the house. "You can rest here for a little while," he said. "But we must be careful. The patrols pass through this area often." His caution made sense. Helping an American soldier could cost them their lives, but despite the danger, they were offering me shelter. The kindness brought tears to my eyes, but I blinked them away. I lay down on the small bed, feeling exhaustion wash over me in waves. Elsa placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "God guided you here." Her words echoed inside me as sleep finally pulled me under. I woke hours later to the sound of hushed voices. When I opened my eyes, Heinrich was sitting near the bed, his expression serious. "There were soldiers nearby," he whispered. "They are searching the area. You cannot stay long." I sat up quickly, fear tightening in my chest. "But we won't send you away with nothing," he added, standing to retrieve a bundle from a nearby chair. Inside were warm clothes, simple, worn, but sturdy. "These belonged to our son," he explained quietly. "He did not come home from the Eastern Front." The weight of his words hit me hard. I took the clothes with trembling hands, whispering, "I'm so sorry." Heinrich nodded, the grief in his eyes deep but steady. After changing into the warmer clothes, I joined Heinrich and Elsa at the kitchen table again. Elsa set a small loaf of bread and a piece of cheese between us. As we ate, Heinrich unfolded a small map on the table. He pointed to the edge of the forest. If you travel west, you will eventually reach the areas where American forces have pushed forward, but you cannot travel alone. There are checkpoints, guards, and patrols everywhere." He tapped a spot near the lower river valley. "My oldest son, Lucas, knows the back roads and the woods. He can guide you at least part of the way. It will still be dangerous, but you will have a chance." Shortly after dusk, a young man entered the house quietly. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious expression. "This is Lucas," Heinrich said. Lucas studied me carefully, his eyes sharp but not unfriendly. "I will take you," he said, "but we must leave now. Patrols will be heavier in the morning." Elsa placed food wrapped in cloth into my hands: bread, a boiled potato, a few dried apples. Then she took my hands in hers and whispered a prayer for protection, her voice trembling with emotion. When she finished, I felt tears burning at the edges of my eyes. "Thank you," I said, my voice almost breaking. She shook her head. "No, thank God. He brought you to us." Lucas led me out the back door into the cold night. The forest loomed behind the house, dark and silent. We moved quickly, staying low and avoiding open fields. Lucas walked with quiet confidence, guiding me through narrow paths known only to locals. He pointed out areas where patrols usually passed and kept his ears tuned to every sound. Several times we heard distant engine rumbling or shouted German voices. Each time we ducked behind trees or crouched low until the danger passed. Lucas carried no weapon, only faith and knowledge of the land. I followed him closely, trusting that God was guiding both of us. Hours passed as we moved west, deeper into the woods. My legs ached, and my breath formed clouds in the freezing night air, but I pushed on. At one point, we heard a truck approaching along a nearby road. Lucas grabbed my sleeve and pulled me behind a group of thick bushes. We crouched low as the headlights swept across the trees. The truck slowed, and German soldiers jumped off, shouting to each other. They spread out, searching the nearby areas. My pulse hammered in my ears. Lucas placed a steady hand on my shoulder, signaling for me not to move. We stayed silent, barely breathing, as boots crunched through the snow only a few yards away. After several minutes, the soldiers climbed back onto the truck and drove off. Lucas exhaled slowly. "We must hurry," he whispered. We continued westward, moving through rolling hills and narrow valleys. The land was rugged, but Lucas navigated it with ease, avoiding main roads and open spaces. The more distance we gained, the lighter my chest felt. I allowed myself to imagine reaching the American lines, seeing familiar uniforms, hearing English again, feeling safe for the first time in months. But each time hope rose too high, I reminded myself that danger still lurked everywhere. The forest grew thinner, and the fields beyond revealed patches of open terrain. We stopped near a cluster of large boulders to rest briefly. Lucas pointed to the dark horizon. "Beyond those hills," he whispered, "the Allies have been moving for days. You are close." Before we could continue, the sharp sound of barking dogs shattered the quiet night. My whole body stiffened. Lucas cursed under his breath and pulled me behind a large oak tree. "They are close," he whispered urgently. The barking grew louder, followed by the familiar crunch of boots and the harsh glow of lanterns weaving between the trees. My heart pounded as I pressed my back against the cold tree bark. Lucas grabbed my arm and whispered, "They must have found a trail. We need to move now." We darted through the trees, weaving between shadows, but the dogs were closing in fast. A German patrol shouted commands, their voices echoing through the forest. One lantern beam swept dangerously close to where we had just been. We sprinted toward the base of the hills, but as we emerged from the trees into a narrow field, A shout rang out behind us. "Halt!" A German patrol had spotted us. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and the barking exploded into a frenzy. Lucas grabbed my wrist and pulled me forward, shouting, "Run!" The night exploded into chaos as boots thundered behind us and dogs lunged against their leashes. We ran into the darkness with everything we had. The moment the German patrol shouted behind us, Lucas and I sprinted with everything we had left. The freezing air cut into my lungs like knives, and my legs burned from exhaustion, but fear pushed me forward faster than I thought possible. The barking of the dogs grew louder as the soldiers charged through the clearing, their lanterns swinging wildly in the darkness. Snow kicked up beneath my feet, blinding me for a moment as I ran. I could hear the crack of branches snapping under heavy boots, the sharp orders shouted in German, and the pounding of my own heartbeat as the cold night swallowed our footsteps. Lucas gripped my arm tightly, guiding us toward the base of the hills where patches of rocky ground offered some cover. We reached the first hill and began climbing upward, our hands scraping against rough stone as we crawled over jagged edges. The snow made everything slippery, and Lucas nearly lost his footing, but I caught him by the sleeve and pulled him back before he slid down the slope. The dogs were getting closer, their barks echoing sharply through the valley. I could hear the jingle of their metal collars and the gruff voices of the soldiers urging them forward. The fear inside me rose like a wave, but I kept climbing, praying under my breath with each step. "Lord, help us! Lord, help us!" When we finally reached the top of the hill, Lucas pointed toward a narrow ravine on the other side. "Go down there," he whispered urgently. "It leads to the river. They cannot follow easily." We slid down the far side of the hill, rocks scraping our hands and legs as we braced ourselves. The descent was steep, and the snow made it difficult to keep balance, but the hill shielded us briefly from the patrol's view. When we reached the bottom, the barking had grown slightly fainter, giving us a moment of relief. Lucas crouched low and listened carefully to the sounds echoing above. "They will search the hillside," he whispered. "We must move before they find the way down." The ravine stretched before us like a dark tunnel, its walls rising high on either side. A thin stream ran along its floor, cutting a winding path through the rocks. We followed it, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The walls muffled the sounds of the patrol, but we knew it wouldn't take long for them to track us again. After several minutes of fast walking, the ravine opened into a wide field bordered by patches of forest. The land dipped downward toward a narrow river that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Lucas pointed across the water. "Beyond that ridge," he whispered, "American forces have been seen. You are close." My heart raced with new energy, fueled by the possibility of freedom. But before we could celebrate, the distant sound of shouting returned, closer this time. Lanterns flickered along the top of the ravine behind us. "They found the trail," Lucas said urgently. "Run!" We sprinted toward the river, snow flying behind us. The ground sloped downward sharply, and both of us stumbled more than once, but we didn't stop. The river came into view, narrow, shallow, with chunks of ice floating along its surface. We reached the edge of the river just as the beams of German flashlights swept across the upper field. Lucas waded into the water first, gasping at the freezing temperature. "Come," he urged. I plunged in after him, the icy water biting into my legs and sending a shock through my entire body. We crossed as quickly as we could, slipping on rocks beneath the surface, but somehow keeping our footing. When we reached the far bank, I grabbed Lucas and pulled him up onto the snow-covered ground. We ran again, heading toward a cluster of trees that offered some cover. Shouts echoed behind us, and a flashlight beam passed dangerously close, but the river had slowed the patrol by forcing them to search for another crossing point. By the time we reached the tree line, my legs felt like heavy stones, and my lungs burned with every breath. Lucas grabbed my shoulder and pointed toward a rise in the land ahead, where faint lights flickered beyond the hills. "American lines," he said in a breathless whisper. The words filled me with a hope so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. But before I could say anything, a gunshot cracked through the air. We ducked instinctively, the sound tearing through the night. Another shot followed, and this time a bullet struck the tree trunk beside me, sending bark flying. The Germans had found a crossing point and were firing blindly into the trees. "Go!" Lucas shouted. "I will distract them." "No," I whispered fiercely, grabbing his arm. "You'll be killed." He shook his head, his expression stern and determined. "You cannot be caught again," he said. "God saved you once. You must finish this." Before I could argue, he stepped out from behind the tree and ran in the opposite direction, crashing through the branches loudly enough to draw attention. German voices shouted after him, and the gunfire shifted toward the sound of his footsteps. Tears stung my eyes, but I forced myself to move. I ran toward the ridge, climbing over fallen branches and pushing through thick brush. Every second felt like a battle between fear and courage. I didn't know if Lucas would survive, but I knew he had given me a chance I could not waste. As I reached the top of the ridge, the ground leveled out into a wide stretch of open land. Faint lights glowed in the distance, flickering steadily like stars, hovering just above the ground. I dropped to my knees and crawled forward carefully, scanning the area for any sign of danger. For a moment, I feared I had misjudged the distance. Then, from beyond a small rise, I heard the low rumble of an engine, deep, familiar, and unmistakably American. My heart surged. "Please, God," I whispered, "please let it be them." I rose to my feet and waved my arms, stumbling into the open field. "Help!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "American soldier, don't shoot!" My words vanished into the cold night air, but I kept yelling, desperate and determined. A moment later, a spotlight swung toward me, blinding me with its glare. I shielded my eyes, trembling, afraid the soldiers might mistake me for an enemy. But then I heard the sweetest sound I had heard in months, a shout in English. "Hold your fire! It's a POW!" Relief flooded through me so quickly I nearly collapsed. A group of American soldiers ran toward me, their uniforms dark against the snow. One of them reached me first and grabbed my arm. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, breathless and wide-eyed. I nodded weakly. My throat felt too tight to speak. "We got you," another soldier said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You're safe now." The words washed over me like warm water. They helped me into a military truck nearby, where a medic immediately wrapped blankets around me. The warmth made my numb fingers sting painfully. But I didn't complain. I leaned back against the wooden panel and closed my eyes as the medic inspected my bruises and cuts. "You're lucky," he said. "You're the first escapee we've seen from that camp." I nodded, still shaking from exhaustion and emotion. "Someone helped me," I whispered. "A German family and a guard." The medic frowned but didn't question me further. Instead, he placed a canteen in my hands. "Drink slowly," he said. I sipped the water, letting it soothe my sore throat. The truck started moving, carrying me away from the nightmare that had almost ended my life. The American base was not far. When we arrived, the soldiers escorted me into a warm tent where several officers questioned me about the camp, the conditions, and the escape. I answered as best as I could, but my mind drifted constantly to Lucas and his family. I prayed silently that they would remain safe from German suspicion. After the questioning, they transferred me to a field hospital where a doctor examined me thoroughly. "Malnourished, dehydrated, and exhausted," he said to one of the nurses. "But alive. That's a miracle." I smiled faintly, knowing that the doctor had no idea just how true those words were. As the nurse cleaned the cuts on my hands, I whispered another prayer. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for saving me." The war continued around us for weeks, but I remained in the field hospital recovering slowly. I gained strength with each passing day, and the nurses often smiled when they saw me studying the small Bible the chaplain had given me. When the American forces pushed further into Germany, the officers arranged for me to be transported back to France. From there, I boarded a ship bound for the United States. During the long journey across the Atlantic, I spent most of my time on deck, staring at the endless water and thinking about everything that had happened: the prison camp, the execution yard, the miracle that had shaken the earth, and the family who risked everything to help me escape. When the ship finally reached New York Harbor, my heart swelled at the sight of the American flag waving high above the port. The moment I stepped onto American soil again, I breathed deeply, feeling a peace I hadn't known in a long time. After processing through the military reception center, I was given a train ticket that would take me home to Kansas. The journey felt surreal. I watched small towns, open fields, and distant mountains pass by as the train rumbled across the countryside. Each mile felt like a step toward a life I had only dreamed of during those dark days in Germany. When the train finally pulled into Dodge City, I saw my mother waiting on the platform, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes scanning the crowd. The moment she saw me, she burst into tears and ran toward me. I dropped my duffel bag and caught her in my arms, feeling her sob against my shoulder. "My boy," she whispered repeatedly. "My boy, thank God." I held her close, my own eyes burning with tears. My father stepped forward, his face pale but filled with pride. He placed a strong hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Welcome home, son." We rode back to the house together and everything felt familiar. The winding dirt road, the white fence, the old oak tree that had stood in our yard since before I was born. But I was no longer the boy who had left to fight a war. I was someone changed, shaped by suffering, faith, and a miracle that had saved my life. In the weeks that followed, news spread through our town that I had survived an execution. Friends, neighbors, and local pastors began asking me to share my story. At first I hesitated, unsure if I could find the right words. But one evening, as I held the New Testament my mother had replaced for me, I felt a quiet nudge in my spirit, a gentle reminder that God hadn't saved me only for myself. He had saved me so others could see the power of His hand. So I began speaking in small churches, school halls, and veterans gatherings. Each time I told the story truthfully, how I was condemned for reading the Bible, how the sky shook with thunder on a clear morning, and how God used an unlikely guard and a brave German family to deliver me from death. People wept when they heard it. Some rediscovered their faith. Others found hope in their own struggles. Many veterans approached me after the meetings, their eyes filled with emotion, saying, "Your story reminded me that God didn't forget us out there." I always nodded because I understood exactly what they meant. We had seen horrors no human should see, but we had also seen moments where heaven reached into the chaos and lifted us up. Years passed, but the fire of that testimony never left me. I continued sharing it across the country, reminding people that miracles still happened, that God's presence was real even in the darkest places. One day, several years after the war ended, a letter arrived from Germany. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was from Elsa and Heinrich. They wrote that their son Lucas had survived and returned home safely after the patrol lost his trail. Tears filled my eyes as I read their words of gratitude and faith. "We thank God that He protected you," Elsa wrote, "and we thank Him that He protected our son as well." I held the letter against my chest for a long moment, overwhelmed by relief. A second letter arrived months later, from the guard who had freed me in the execution yard. His words were simple but powerful. "I am alive, I am safe, and I have given my life to Christ. Thank you for praying." Reading those words nearly brought me to my knees. The miracle God had begun in that prison yard had continued, touching lives far beyond my own. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my Bible, knowing it would remain there for the rest of my life. As the years passed, I continued to share my testimony wherever God led me. I married, started a family, and built a life filled with peace instead of fear. But I never forgot the cold yard where the rifles had been raised, or the thunder that cracked across a clear sky, or the unexplainable power that pulled me from the grip of death. Whenever I ended my testimony, I always left people with the same words. Words that burned deep in my heart since the night before dawn shattered the silence of Stalag VII-A. "If Jesus could find me in a Nazi execution yard," I would say, "then He can find you wherever you are. No darkness is too deep, no prison is too strong, and no moment is too late for Him to save a life." And I knew every word of it was true.